Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, How to Tell When a Kid is Struggling Emotionally, hosted by National PTA and American Psychological Association. At this point, I would now like to ask our hosts from the National PTA and American Psychological Association to go ahead and introduce themselves. Over to you.
Hello, I'm Otha Thornton, National PTA President.
And hi, I'm Catherine Nordel of the American Psychological Association.
As the nation's largest volunteer child advocacy association, with more than 4 million members who are parents, students, and educators, National PTA committed to the mental health of all our early childhood through adulthood. We know that the mental health is an essential part of overall health, and when a child or youth is mentally healthy, they are more equipped to learn and reach their full potential. National PTA demonstrates commitment to every child tonight by connecting families, educators, and others who serve youth with experts from the American Psychological Association who provide us with the information and resources we need to support our youth. Every child, every tween, every teen, at times when they may be struggling emotionally. I want to thank Dr. Nordel and the American Psychological Association for your partnership in communicating this important information tonight. And I want to thank all of you, hundreds of concerned parents, educators, and professionals who work on a daily basis with our youth, for taking the time out of your day to join us for this critical conversation.
The APA is very excited to partner with PTA. Our organizations have mutual goals and interests when it comes to health and families, and the APA and PTA both agree that addressing mental health is essential to ensuring our children's health and well-being. In 2013, APA and the YMCA of the USA did a similar webinar on how to tell if a kid is struggling emotionally for Y staff and camp counselors. The Y, like the PTA and APA, is committed to educating our communities about behavioral health and identifying when a child may be distressed. An estimated 13 to 20% of children in the United States experience a mental health disorder in any given year. Our research tells us that mental health problems, when not properly treated, can negatively affect children's overall health and development and contribute to problems at home, in the school, and in relationships. And these problems can continue into adulthood. Mental health problems can be successfully treated and managed. Research shows that early diagnosis and appropriate treatment for children and their families can make a difference in the lives of kids struggling with an emotional problem or a mental health disorder. But before that, the most crucial phase is picking up on those signs and symptoms of emotional distress or detecting that something may be wrong. And the earlier, the better. The PTA and APA want to help you learn to recognize emotional struggles in children and know how to distinguish between emotional problems and normal behavior. So we're very pleased to have 3 APA members who work with kids and teens be able to join us today. All of the psychologists, including myself, will be available to answer questions following the presentation. Psychologists are not able to respond to specific questions or comments about personal situations, appropriate diagnosis or treatment, or provide clinical opinions. This webinar is for informational and educational purposes.
Now I'd like to introduce the first psychologist, Mary Albert. Dr. Albert in Maryland works with our youth and families. She's a member of the American Psychological Association. She's also very active. Has been very active in our local PTA unit for many years. Dr. Albert is going to provide us an overview of the signs of distress, depression, and other problems typical in youth who may be experiencing emotional difficulties.
Thank you, President Thornton. I'm very excited to be talking to you today. When my 3 kids were growing up, I was personally involved in my local PTAs over a period of 18 years, including becoming co-PTA president at their elementary school and then continuing my PTA involvement during their high school years. Also, as a psychologist, I've given dozens of talks to PTAs over the years, so I'm thrilled to reconnect with the PTA again. Now let's get started. I'm going to focus on 6 main areas of common emotional problems seen in youth: anxiety, disruptive behavior, depression, substance exposure and use, trauma-related stress, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or more commonly known as ADHD. Before we cover those 6 common areas, let's talk about some typical signs to look for in your kids. The first is feeling sad, down, or having low energy. Another sign is acting irritable. For example, if your kids become angry or upset with small comments that usually never bother them, perhaps they think in all or nothing terms. This means that they might think something is all good or that they are a failure, and they have a hard time seeing that middle ground. The third is being on edge, which means easily startled or perhaps overreactive or having outbursts. So, for example, if your kid's teacher or someone in your family says they're feeling uncomfortable or threatened by an outburst your child is having, it could be a sign that something more is going on. Feeling extremely protective of or fearful for the safety of loved ones. For example, if your kid is overly clingy and doesn't allow you to leave him or sticks close to you when you drop them off for school. Another example is a child asking for reassurance and saying, "What if this happens?" or "Is this going to be okay?" Feeling scattered or unable to focus more than what you would expect. So, for example, you notice that your kid is having difficulty concentrating or sticking with an activity. Withdrawal is also a significant sign of distress. Does your child or teen isolate himself or herself from social activities or from friends, or frequently remove him or herself from activities? And sleep problems. They can usually have difficulty either falling asleep or perhaps staying asleep. Persistent or recurring nightmares, and excessive daytime sleepiness. So if you notice that your kids are having difficulty staying alert, it may be that they're not getting sufficient or good quality sleep. Problems staying awake during the day. And changes in appetite. Have you noticed that your kid is either overeating or eating very little? That can be a sign that there is a problem. Sudden change in behavior. This means any significant change from the typical way your child responds or acts. For example, a child who's outgoing and engaging and has a lot of friends suddenly becomes quiet, withdrawn, and notably reserved. Let's move on to anxiety. So getting back to common problems, we're going to start with anxiety. Anxiety is characterized by feelings of tension and worried thoughts. Anxiety, like many other emotions, is a normal thing to experience. Sometimes a little anxiety can be good because it can help us to respond to challenge and motivate us to accomplish tasks. But people with anxiety problems tend to experience high levels of fear or worry and tend to avoid situations that they're finding troubling. They may also have physical symptoms such as sweating, trembling, dizziness, or a rapid heartbeat. Everyone worries or experiences anxiety at times. It's normal for kids to worry about how they might fit in school or whether they'll be able to do well academically or in sports or any other after-school activities. But when you notice that your child's anxiety is frequent and intense, then you need to be concerned and be alert about this situation. In kids, sometimes anxiety shows up through frequent health complaints without any obvious illness. So, for example, stomach aches and headaches are common, and frequent avoidance is also a key indicator of possible anxiety or fear. So if your child is reluctant to participate in an activity, it might be that he is worried or has fears that something bad might happen to either himself or herself or to other people. This is common with test taking. You see a lot of anxiety. A child may freeze up before a test because he or she may have anxiety about how they're going to do on the test. Now let's turn more to anxiety and the specific types of anxiety. The most common anxiety disorders include separation anxiety, generalized anxiety, and social anxiety. The first one you see here, separation anxiety, occurs when kids don't want to leave a parent or caregiver. For example, children may refuse to go to school or may be upset during the day and want to call home or may even want to text home. It's important to distinguish between normal versus abnormal separation anxiety. Kids with separation anxiety disorder will almost always have a strong level of distress and may cry or even have a sense of panic. They might also avoid engaging in activities. They may ask often about their parents or caregivers and will experience these symptoms and others for a prolonged period of time, like several weeks. Generalized anxiety next is when kids worry excessively about many things over a period of time, when there is no obvious danger. For example, kids who worry excessively and frequently say, "What if such and such happens?" or "What if something goes wrong?" We call that kind of the what if questioning, expecting that things will go badly and may frequently seek reassurance that things will be okay. Finally, social anxiety involves a high degree of anxiety in social situations and avoidance of those situations. Some shyness is normal, but when a child or teen excessively worries about what someone might think of him or her, or avoids social situations or group activities, it may lead to withdrawal and social isolation. So now let's move on to disruptive behavior. Child misbehavior is very common and not necessarily a sign of a mental health problem. It's typical for kids and teens to want to test boundaries and try out new behaviors. It's part of growing up and child development. So misbehavior becomes a significant problem when the severity of the behaviors increase and when the behaviors interfere with normal child development and family function. So if your child can't function the way that they have been and it's interfering, that's a sign. I want to start first with bullying, since it's something we often hear about in our communities and in the news, and it is of great concern. It's important to understand that bullying has several aspects. First, there is the bystander, a child who watches a friend or a peer bully another kid and does nothing about it. This actually perpetuates the bullying. Then there is the witness. Kids who see other kids being bullied can be affected by the bullying just by witnessing it. Then there's the kid who is being bullied, or actually the kid who is a bully is also of great concern. Bullying causes stress in kids, whether they are the ones being bullied, witnessing it, or being the bystander. There's a spectrum also of bullying. So for example, when a student has a dominance over another kid, we call this a power differential. It can be physical or social power. For example, it can be a physically big kid trying to dominate a smaller size kid. But it can also be through gestures and tone of voice and volume. Another form of bullying typical among girls is isolating other girls, whispering and gossiping about them, excluding them. But boys do it a little differently. They're more likely to say mean things or be physical. It's typically more overt. Bullying is usually sneaky and out of sight of teachers and parents, which makes it so difficult to deal with. Some other signs of disruptive behavior in kids include misinterpreting situations and presuming that others have hostile intentions toward them and becoming aggressive, yelling frequently, disobeying directions from parents, teachers, or coaches, or refusing to follow rules, and a constant and severe meanness toward others. It's not only what kind of behavior, but how often it's happening and how intense it is. And we're going to repeat that several times. You'll hear that Normal behavior versus what is of concern is often the intensity and the frequency. Now let's turn to discuss two specific disruptive behaviors. There are two primary disruptive behavior disorders: oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. In oppositional defiant disorder, a child is defiant toward authority figures. So an example is a child who disobeys directions from a camp counselor, a teacher, or a parent. With oppositional defiant disorder, there's usually a pattern of consistent and extreme disobedience and opposition. Conduct disorder is the most serious of disruptive disorders. It's when a kid or teen displays a pattern of extreme aggression and disregard for rules and laws. So, for example, stealing or destroying property. Let's move on to ADHD. I want to say a few words about ADHD, also called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. First, it's important to know that ADHD is not a disruptive behavior disorder. It's actually considered a neurodevelopmental condition. It tends to show up during a kid's developmental years and involves high levels of inattentiveness and/or hyperactivity and impulsivity. Difficulties with disorganization are also typical, and oftentimes inattentiveness and high levels of overactivity are normal for children. It's when these behaviors become constant and extreme, and when it interferes with their functioning at school or getting homework done, that there's reason for concern. Let's turn to depression. Depression is more than just sadness. People with depression may experience a lack of interest and pleasure in daily activities, insomnia or excessive sleeping, lack of energy, and an inability to concentrate. Other symptoms of depression include significant weight loss or weight gain, feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt, and recurrent thoughts of death or suicide. You don't have to have all of these symptoms, but these are all keys to look for. Because everyone feels sad or blue on occasion. It's also perfectly normal for kids and adults to grieve over upsetting life experiences, such as a major illness or a death in the family. But for most people, these feelings of grief and sadness tend to lessen with the passing of time. However, if you notice your children's feelings of sadness last for 2 weeks or longer, and if their mood and behaviors interfere with daily life activities, something more serious than feeling blue may be going on. For kids, situations at school, camp, and with friends, such as poor grades, teasing, and bullying, can have an emotional effect. Additionally, changes in the family, including a move, parents separating or divorcing, parents remarrying, family conflict, or arrival of a new sibling, can affect kids' lives. So kids who are depressed may become overwhelmed and exhausted and may stop participating in activities they enjoy. They may even say that there is nothing that they look forward to and nothing is fun. They may withdraw from family and friends, and they may also have difficulty concentrating on schoolwork. They may make statements indicating poor self-esteem or a negative self-image. Or they might express feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness. Additional symptoms of depression are increases in temper tantrums or irritability and reckless and destructive behaviors, such as drinking alcohol, doing drugs, or engaging in unsafe sexual activities. Let's move on. Substance abuse, and it may be hard for parents to hear, but the reality is that there are kids out there who are drinking and are accessing drugs, including prescription drugs, at a fairly young age. An estimated 10 million people aged 12 to 20 report drinking alcohol during the past month. To put that in perspective, there are more Americans who've engaged in underage drinking than the number of people who live in the state of Michigan. And I'm sure you know the risks that come with alcohol and drug consumption. injuries, accidents, illness, or developing an addiction problem. 5,000 people under age 21 die sadly each year from alcohol-related car crash, homicides, suicides, alcohol poisoning, and other injuries such as falls, burns, and even drowning. Let's move on. If you're concerned that your kids might be drinking, some of the signs to look for include academic or behavioral problems in school, changing groups of friends. Friends are critical during childhood and teenagehood, so pay attention to that. Less interest in activities or in their own appearance. Finding alcohol among a young person's things like their school bag or even smelling alcohol on their breath. And look for the more subtle keys like slurred speech or coordination difficulties, perhaps even memory or concentration problems. And they're not always truthful about where they are, so that is something to look into. Let's move on to trauma-related stress. Unfortunately, some children experience traumatic events during their childhood. A traumatic event can mean different things to different people and could include a car accident, house fire, or a sudden death of a loved one, even a sibling or a parent. There's a long list of what constitutes trauma, including abuse or incidents like bullying or school shootings or sexual assaults. Trauma is an individual experience that varies among people and age groups. For example, what might seem like a situation of boys being boys to one person may be viewed as bullying or really even extremely traumatic to another. Experience of trauma does not necessarily mean that anything long-term or impairing will result for a child, but you do need to be alert to the situation and watch the symptoms. For those who do experience long-term difficulties related to a traumatic experience, there are some additional symptoms to watch out for. Children may re-experience a traumatic event through flashbacks, nightmares, or even reenactment through their play. Or kids may experience what are called hyperarousal symptoms, including angry outbursts, difficulty sleeping, or difficulty concentrating. And you'll see that I've mentioned some of the same symptoms for different conditions. So we really need to look at what the composite is and how it's functionally impairing. They may also appear sad or withdraw from family or friends or even from classmates. Now I'd like to turn to my colleague. Dr. Michael Southam-Giroux is a psychologist from Virginia Commonwealth University.
Hi everyone. Now that Dr. Alvord has covered what you should look for, I'd like to talk about what you can do if you think your child might be distressed or has any of the signs that Dr. Alvord described. So let's move on and take a look. The good news is there's a lot we can do to help kids when we think they might be struggling. First, we can listen to them. It might seem like a simple thing, simple advice. Listening attentively, though, shows that you really care about kids, and it also helps them know they're not alone. You can also encourage them. Getting support and finding ways to handle stress are important social skills for all children and teens. It's important to encourage your kids to ask for help. Creating an environment where asking for help is okay can go a long way. Let your kids know that when they ask for help, they are advocating for themselves, and it's a sign of courage. Now, we are also super good models for kids. Like when we have to solve a problem, they're watching us. They learn from our examples and behaviors. So one thing we recommend is that you model your problem solving. Think out loud in front of kids. State the problem you're grappling with. Generate several possible solutions. Think about the pros and the cons. Talk through what you're going to try. And let the kids know that if your first idea doesn't work out, you're going to go back and try some of the others, that you're going to problem solve again. You can also just talk with them, asking them what's going on. Some good examples of questions might be wondering what you're thinking about, or how are you feeling today? You can also point out things you notice, like, I noticed you didn't do your homework today. How can I help? Or I noticed that you didn't talk to your friends today. What can I do to help you with that? Or if they're struggling with an activity like homework, for example, you can ask, what's making that so hard? It's also good to try to avoid questions that are answered with a yes-no, asking questions that are more open-ended, that encourage discussion, starting with words like what, who, how, when, where, and why. You can also reassure and redirect. We focus on helping to reassure them and redirect them towards activities and interacting with their friends instead of perhaps staying by themselves in their room. You can also empower kids. There are several ways we can do this. You can serve as positive role models to them and help guide them in building positive relationships. Developing good relationship with their friends and classmates, too, can help teach them how to support each other by encouraging and complimenting one another during after-school activities, or how to listen to other people's feelings and express empathy. We have the chance to provide our kids with examples on how to handle conflict and create positive resolutions in social situations. Additionally, we can teach kids how to set realistic and clear boundaries in relationships and have appropriate behavior in groups. Also, a good message to help empower kids is encourage them to talk to you about any concern they might have. Now let's move on and talk about some tips for talking with kids. It's not always the easiest thing to do, talking with kids. Sometimes they don't seem to want to talk to adults very much. We do have a few general tips, though, on how we can effectively communicate with kids. First is to listen to their feelings. Kids will sometimes talk about their feelings more than they'll talk about situations. So you can let them know they're not alone, that lots of people might have that feeling. You can acknowledge and thank them for talking to you. Anytime they say anything, it's good for them to receive some praise for doing that. It takes courage for them to reveal personal things to adults, especially things that they might think are embarrassing. It's also good when we're talking to kids to keep it at their appropriate age level. It's important to remember that children and teenagers are not small adults, but to think of them at their age, whatever their age happens to be, or their developmental age. It's also obviously really good to be compassionate and to remember to use our best empathy skills when talking to kids. It's also really important to normalize negative emotions your kids might be feeling. You can say something like, all people at times feel anxious or sad or whatever it is the kid's feeling. It can be really good for kids to know they're not alone. Sometimes when they're having those feelings, they might feel like they're the only kid in the school who's afraid or is feeling sad. So it's good for them to know they're not alone. Of course, we also can use this opportunity to monitor the kids' talk, because as it becomes, as Dr. Alvord mentioned, more intense or more frequent, some of the more negative talk, that could be a sign of a problem. So as they're talking, it's good for us to be listening for that. We also can affirm and support the need for asking for help when they have a problem or feel distressed. Again, like I said, it's really good when they reach out to us, so we make sure that they know we appreciate that. It's also really important for us as adults to be honest with kids. If you're a teacher, this is especially important when communicating that you may need to talk with their parents or seek outside help. It's good for them to know that you're straightforward and upfront about it. And in the end, our priority, of course, is to keep kids safe. So let's move on and talk a bit about how we can help kids build resilience. We all know that life has its ups and downs. We all have the ability to learn how to deal with life challenges. There's good research now that shows resilience is a key to coping and dealing with tough situations. And everyone can learn skills that help them be more resilient. The more we can do to help kids build resiliency skills, the better able they will be to handle challenges throughout their lives. Resilience is the ability to adapt well to adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant sources of stress. Oftentimes, people describe it as bouncing back. When working with kids, we say, how bouncy is your brain? We also explain that resilience is like a muscle. It makes us stronger, and the more we use resilience, the stronger we get. With older kids, we might talk about it like a rubber band that stretches with stress and problems, but we can do things to make the rubber band go back to its flexible state. Help them know they can try new things. Effort is what counts, not immediate success. Make sure there is a lot of praise for trying. Resilience can help our children manage stress and feelings of anxiety and uncertainty. However, being resilient does not mean that children won't experience difficulty or distress. Emotional pain and sadness are common when we have suffered major trauma or personal loss, or even when we hear of someone else's loss or trauma. We all can develop resilience, and we can help kids and teens develop it as well. It involves behaviors, thoughts, and actions that can be learned and practiced over time. Let's move on and talk about some steps to building resilience. It's not something you're born with, resilience, that you either have it or you don't. Resilience is something we learn. There are skills and strategies for building resilience. Some of them may seem very obvious, and probably many of the things that y'all are doing on the call now. It's also important to understand that there is no one single way to build resilience, and there's no prescribed timeline. It's a lifelong journey, as everyone on the call knows, I'm sure. What works for one kid may not work for other kids and teens, even within your own family. Steps to building resilience include making connections. Good relationships with family members, with friends, or others in the community are important. Having at least one good friend helps protect against bullying and feeling isolated. Accepting help or support from those who care about you and will listen to you strengthens your resilience. Another step is accepting that change is part of living. While we can't control everything, there are many aspects of our life that we can control. So accepting circumstances that are out of our control free us up to focus on those things that we can manage. A third step is moving toward our goals. Instead of focusing on tasks that seem unachievable or huge, ask yourself, what's one thing I know I can accomplish today that helps me move in the direction I want to go? It's also important as the fourth step to keep things in perspective. Avoid blowing a stressful event out of proportion. For example, this is something we've all seen in the news when people are catastrophizing situations. When a child is facing very painful events, help him or her look at the situation in a broader context, keeping a long-term perspective. Try to get them to look ahead towards the future instead of dwelling on the past. An optimistic and positive outlook enables a child to see the good things in life and can help him or her keep going even in the hardest of times. And the last step is a really important one, taking care of yourself. Pay attention to your own needs and feelings. That will help keep your mind and body primed to deal with situations that require resilience. When it comes to helping kids build their resilience skills, it's important to be mindful that kids have cultural experiences influencing their lives. Having a positive racial and ethnic identity can promote leadership skills, optimism, better grades, and academic achievement. It also helps with self-esteem, self-acceptance, goal-setting, and problem-solving skills. These are all things tied to resilience. Also, it's important to note that resilience is not the ability to suppress or push aside negative emotions, such as anxiety, depression, or anger. Suppressing emotions can actually lead to additional problems. Resilience can be about finding ways to appropriately express these emotions and learn healthy ways of coping. So let's move on. I'd like to turn to my colleague, Dr. Lori McCubbin from Washington State University.
Hello, everyone. I want to talk about how you determine when it's time to get help and who to turn to for help. So in terms of, let's move on to when to get help. So you've tried to encourage, empower, and talk to your kids, but you still have serious concerns that a problem exists. What do you do next? If you have some concerns that your child or teen may not be coping well, then it may be time to get help. There are a number of important signs to pay attention to and that most likely require seeking help. They include displaying aggressive outbursts that feel frightening to you or your family or friends. For example, when your kid's outburst feels threatening to you or someone else, or it feels out of control. Persistent display of signs of anxiety, depression, or trauma for several days or longer. For example, a kid seems sad and withdrawn almost the whole day for 3 or more days in a row. Witnessing or overhearing your kids discussing using alcohol or drugs. Overhearing your kid talk about physically or emotionally harming another person. Continuing on with when to get help, how do you tell when it's time to get help? There are several warning signs. You or a teacher overhear your child or adolescent talking of hurting himself or killing himself. You notice signs of possible self-mutilation. For example, seeing cuts on your kids' wrists or noticing that your kids are always wearing long sleeves or pants even in the heat of the summer. A lot of kids who cut themselves will try to hide it. A kid mentions abuse or neglect or sexual assault or rape or unexplained bruises. For example, a kid cannot tell you how they got the bruises. They may be trying to hide something. Witnessing or overhearing your kids discuss engaging in or planning on an antisocial act, such as vandalism, theft, or starting a fire. If you hear your child or adolescent talking about hurting or killing him or herself, or if she or he mentions abuse or rape, sit down with them and try to find out what happened. And immediately call your pediatrician, your school nurse, or a counselor, or even a crisis center. The school should be able to direct you to other appropriate resources. So who can help? There are many ways you can seek out help in working with children and adolescents. So who can you turn to? There are all types of professionals. If your kid's school has a counselor or a school psychologist on staff, consider starting with that person. They're familiar with the school, the teachers, the staff, and the students. If not, the student might have a nurse who can provide other resources. Also, every community typically has a crisis center or a hotline, which is another good resource. Your pediatrician may be able to help. The American Academy of Pediatricians have guidelines for mental health screenings. So pediatricians who are members of this professional association will most likely be familiar with the guidelines and can include a mental health screening in your child or adolescent's regular physical exam. You may want to first call your pediatrician to talk about any symptoms your child or teen may be displaying and determine the next step. Your pediatrician may also be able to refer you to a mental health professional who works with kids or teenagers or even tweens and families. Another resource is your employer's Employee Assistant Program. It's also typically referred to as EAP. If you're worried about your child or adolescent, you could start by talking to someone at the EAP to help you figure out next steps. Most EAP programs provide short-term help, like 5 to 6 visits, and then can provide a list of professionals like psychologists, social workers, and other mental health providers available for longer-term treatment. Check your employee benefits to see how your workplace EAP is constructed. If you see evidence that a child or a teen may be trying to take his or her own life, call 911. Please stay with him or her while help is getting to you. It's important to always stay with someone who is talking of hurting oneself or taking their own life. Now let's move on to the portion we call to Ask the Psychologist. We'd like to invite you to ask questions and chat with us. This question and answer segment is for informational and educational purposes. We are not able to respond to specific questions or comments about personal situations to diagnose somebody or to provide treatment or to provide any clinical opinions. At this time, I'd like to ask the operator to open up the phone lines for your questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. McCubbin, and we're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the question pane in your attendee control panel. I'm going to go ahead and start with our first question here from Janet. And Janet saying, my 17-year-old high school junior shuts down completely when he gets angry and he won't talk to us, his parents, for a week. Is it better to ignore him until he chooses to speak again or continue to talk to him even without getting a response?
This is Dr. Alvord. Again, we can't specifically say for this 17-year-old, but in general terms, we wait for usually a cool down period of time, but if it extends for a week, then there may be other situations going on. So again, with all the symptoms that I have talked about, it's not usually one symptom then sends the alert system, but you really then begin to look at the whole environment and see what else might be going on that's bothering your child or your teen. And maybe even talking with other parents or talking with the school and gathering information.
Can I just add one thing to that last question, which is kind of some general advice about talking to kids, not specifically to the 17-year-old, but the teenagers in particular, can be to try a variety of different modalities and a variety of different situations to talk. So sometimes directly talking one-on-one can be harder. So going out on an outing somewhere, taking a walk, taking the kid to the mall, taking them to the soda fountain or whatever, get them ice cream, going and kicking the soccer ball around in the field, taking a drive in the car. Any of those things can sometimes get a kid out of a set and help them talk. Sometimes even texting directly to a kid. They might feel more comfortable texting to you versus speaking face-to-face from a different room. So in general, we try to get a kid communicating in some fashion, maybe writing notes in a notebook, all kinds of ideas like that.
All right, I'll go ahead and mute Linda. Going to go to a question here from Annette. Annette saying, can schools require families to receive behavioral health evaluations prior to returning to the classroom? And if not, how?
This is Dr. Alvord. I can't say for all schools, but I'm in practice, so often when there is something of concern, then the child, teen might say that they are thinking about harming themselves or someone else. At that point, typically the student is referred either to the crisis center in the community or to a local practitioner to just make sure that they're safe prior to being returned to school. So I think each jurisdiction probably has their various different protocol.
And let's go to Annette. Can schools require families to receive behavioral health? From Alicia. What can a parent do when there is no support from school?
Well, you know, some of our families feel that they don't have the support of school, and so they try to gather all the resources that they have in the community. But typically, if there is enough concern, then they can ask for, in my area, it's called an educational management team meeting, so that everyone comes to the table to address the concerns, and there doesn't have to be a diagnosis. It's just parents who are concerned can bring this to the table and ask for everyone else in the school, or for the key players in the school to participate. But there are many other professionals that may be able to help and design a program that's appropriate for the child.
Okay, and I think we're going to go ahead and have one more question here from Jennifer. What can a parent do when their child refuses to participate in psychological treatment?
Well, this is Mary Alvord again. You know, we have kids who come in and they do not want to talk to anybody. So typically we may let them know that, you know, we try to engage them depending on the age with activities or talking. But, you know, especially with a teenager, we'll say that they have a choice and that decisions might be made without them unless they participate. And sometimes we'll move toward a family a model rather than just the child or the teen participating and being the focal point. And usually they'll come around and because they want to know what's going to happen and want to participate, or at least participate in the results.
Yeah, this is Dr. Nordel, and I'd like to add to that as well. I've had a lot of years of experience in working with children and with adolescents, and I think one of the things is for the treating professional to let the youngster know that their perspective on things is really important. Oftentimes I found when a family came and wanted to drag a teenager in, so to speak, that after spending some time with the family, it was very obvious that there were other issues there as well. And so trying to involve the youngster as a collaborator in solving the problems in the family as compared with finger pointing that the child was all of the problem, I found to be helpful. And interestingly, there were some cases or families that I worked with where parents thought, oh my gosh, we never got through to the kid, and many years later, that same adolescent came back to see me about their own children. So it's very obvious that, I mean, we have effect and impact a lot of times in a very positive way, even when a parent may not realize it. But I think that the key is you can't do the finger pointing at the kid. And you have to recognize that whatever the youngster's problems are, the problems are in the context of the family and the rest of the environment. So if you can engage them as part of the information seeking and problem solving to help resolve whatever the broader issues are, I find that youngsters are much more receptive that way when they're seen as an equal partner in the problem solving.
This is Dr. McCubbin. I've also found it helpful, the child or the teenager knows there is a problem, and the reason they're reluctant to talk is if you go straight to the problem, that can be very threatening and very vulnerable and can feel that they're being judged. And some of the times when I work with children and teens, it's really important to build rapport, to build a relationship. And so a lot of times I don't necessarily go directly to the problem. I might have them share a drawing they made or talk about their favorite musician and what their lyrics mean to them and what speaks to them if they don't speak about it. Just indirect ways to get to know who they are, to get to know their context. And inevitably, then their problem emerges. But they're really wanting to make sure they can trust you, that you're there to help, not judge them or reprimand them. And so that's really important. And I have had many parents come with their children to the therapy office and the child doesn't come out of the car. I've done many therapies getting the child out of the car, and usually it takes about 1 minute before they come in.
Well, I would like to say thank you to Dr. Alvord and Dr. Southern-Giroux, Dr. McCubbin, and Dr. Nordahl. Folks, before we close, I'd like to invite Dr. Nordahl and President Thornton to share some resources with you. So over to you, Dr. Nordahl.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank all of you for joining today's webinar. We do have some additional resources to help you become more familiar with the signs of emotional distress in youth and ways that you can help. There are resources available on the PTA website. There are also resources available on the American Psychological Association's Help Center. We have a new tip sheet on how to talk to your kids and teens, and some additional reading and an additional reading list. And you will also see on the slide that there are good resources available through the federal government, through the National Institute on Drug Abuse, through the mental health organization that the government sponsors, and there's some websites there. So I'd like to turn it now back over to PTA President Otha Thornton.
Thank you, Dr. Nordahl, and to all our participants in tonight's special event. We'd like to thank all our participants. I know as a parent, a mentor, and PTA leader, I've learned so much tonight about how to recognize and help a child who may be emotionally struggling. Today's PTA is all about providing our members with relevant resources and will aid us in ensuring that every child's potential becomes a reality. Tonight's conversation is just one example of those resources. For those of you listening tonight who are not yet PTA members, I encourage you to join PTA now. Whether you choose to connect with us locally or choose to join our national PTA unit, you connecting with us is essential to PTA delivering our mission. Learn how you can get connected with today's PTA at pta.org, join now, /join, or follow us on our social media sites where we will continue this conversation tonight. That site again is pta.org/join. Tomorrow you'll receive a survey asking for feedback on this event. Your insights will help us to shape the future events such as this. Also, we will send you the link of the recording of this event so that you can share it with your PTA and social networks. On behalf of the National PTA and the American Psychological Association, thank you for joining us today. We hope you found this information and dialogue valuable. and supporting a kid that you love. You can make a difference. Good night.